Chapter 4. Into the Grosswing nest. Laura. The rescue team continued deeper into the Taymore wilderness. After a while, the underbrush became so thick that Thorn called the vehicle to a stop and prepared a team to set out on foot. He left Privates Mayfield and Dolan behind with the truck so they could make a quick getaway if necessary. Laura accompanied the group so she could lead the way with the sensor. She inhaled deeply as she took in the humid air tinged with sweetness and musk. They were surrounded by a wall of beautiful green flora on either side. She stretched her arms and legs and let the peaceful atmosphere wash over her. She really needed to relax, and the dazzling array of colorful flowers made her happy. She admired one especially impressive bloom. It was dinner plate-sized with bright pink and maroon petals and a row of long spines around its edges. Her sensor device beeped louder as they went farther into the woods. Laura couldn't tell if it was her imagination, but the beeps were starting to sound a bit strained, almost like the device was in pain. One of the privates looked over her shoulder. "Do you suppose you might be using a bit too much Adustum energy on that thing?" Laura's cheeks reddened. She tried to back off on the device, but her anxiety only seemed to make it worse. "Captain, may I recommend that we turn that device off for the time being?" Braylon commented. "If we are close to the nest, any noise is liable to give away our position." Thorn nodded his agreement. Laura paused to turn off the device and hefted over her shoulder. At least now she could pay more attention to the veritable arboretum around her. She had almost forgotten about monsters that ate people when Braylon raised a fist to signal for the group to stop. He held a finger to his lips and then indicated a spot in the clearing below them. Laura could barely make out a dusty creature scrabbling through the forest. It turned out that Grosswings were even more revolting in daylight. The creature's skin was a light gray color, and its body was coated in a layer of muck. The creature had rows of eyes on either side of its elongated, crocodile-like head. Enormous bat wings were furled on the sides of its body. She felt her chest tighten at the sight. Captain Thorn whispered to the group, "We need to stay quiet in case there are other Grosswings nearby. Let's hunker down and wait for it to leave." They slunk along the edge of the clearing and found cover behind a stand of bushes. Laura sighed internally. She had gotten in such a good mood from looking at the plants in the forest. Seeing the Grosswing had reminded her of the unpleasant reason they were there in the first place. "It doesn't look like it noticed us," Thorn whispered. "We should be fine. Just everyone, keep low." "Laura!" Laura looked down at the ground. It was 2 yards below her feet. Darn it. "I've started levitating again." She stifled a gasp and squirmed in the air to try to get down below the bushes. "It's seen us!" Thorn yelped. "Don't let it get away. It'll alert the others." The soldiers charged toward the Grosswing. The creature had started approaching at the sight of Laura, but now turned and ran back toward the trees, spreading its wings to take off. Braylon threw his sword into the beast, and the blade sunk deeply into its shoulder. The creature floundered sideways, letting out a strangled squawk. Thorn jumped on the Grosswing from behind, struggling to silence the noise. It squirmed and slashed at Thorn, ripping his clothes with its back talons. Thorn let out a growl of pain, but would not let go of the creature, instead stabbing it in the neck until it went motionless. Meanwhile, Laura was battling a growing sense of panic. She tried grabbing the branches of the nearest bush to pull herself down, but the leaves just tore off in her hands. Nothing sturdier was within reach. To make matters worse, the force of trying to grab the branches caused her to rotate in the air. Now she was squirming in the air upside down. Well, at least the change of military-issue clothes they gave me included a pair of pants. A strong gust of wind slammed into her body, driving her farther into the air. She restrained a yelp as she watched the ground moving farther and farther away. In her mind, she could see herself being blown far into the sky and off the edge of the Terra. "Help!" she whimpered. "Throw us the rope." Braylon stretched himself upward as he called out to her. The rope from earlier was still fastened around her ankle, with the extra length coiled at her waist like a lasso. She loosened the coil and tossed one end to Braylon. Braylon reached for the rope, but before he could grab it, a gust of wind brushed it from his fingertips. More of the soldiers joined in, chasing the trailing lead all over the clearing. Her cheeks burned as she watched them run in circles below her. This was awful. It felt like she was repeatedly being punished for a single slip-up on her first night in a strange place. How was she supposed to know the native alcohol was such a bizarre concoction? Nothing remotely that weird existed back on her home Terra. It isn't fair. None of this is fair. Why am I being picked on? Finally, one of the soldiers managed to snag the end of the rope, and they all began pulling her down. On her way back to the ground, she noticed a brightly colored object in the grass. That looks out of place. Once her feet were firmly planted on solid dirt, she gingerly stepped over to investigate. It appeared to be a wooden object with brick red paint. Lifting it up, she wiped the dirt away with her fingers. It was a child's toy truck. Her body froze as a shock of recognition flashed through her mind. Captain Thorne, look at this, she managed to stammer out. Yesterday, I met a little boy, back at the village. This is his truck. Thorne narrowed his eyes as he looked down at the toy. That is definitely possible. He straightened before ordering his soldiers to search the area nearby for signs of the nest. Her momentary excitement at being useful was instantly dampened when Thorne ordered her to stay behind with a soldier holding her rope. She pretended to be invisible as she watched the soldiers sift into the forest in search of the nest.
Thorne. Captain Thorne could faintly hear leaves rustling on the other side of the bushes. Hardly daring to breathe, he gently pushed back a branch and peered through. There it was. Thorne could see the Grosswing nest on the other side of a dense hedge of bushes. The opening was approximately 4 feet in diameter and built up with a tangle of branches mixed with mud. It protruded only a few feet above ground, but doubtless reached deep into the earth. All around the opening were droppings and scattered bones, picked clean and gleaming in the sunlight. There were no Grosswings visible presently, but there could be hundreds sleeping inside. Thorne signaled the other soldiers and indicated the nest. They all withdrew a safe distance before anyone dared to make a sound. "We are going to enter the nest in single file," Thorne instructed in a hoarse whisper. "Stay within sight of the person in front of you. The goal is to get in and out without waking the Grosswings if possible. There might be a few insomniacs wandering around, so keep your heads on a swivel." He paused as he took in their grim expressions, then continued. "The man in the back will carry our star oil lantern. It will offer some protection, but it won't be enough by itself if they swarm us. Keep your weapons ready and be prepared to get out at a moment's notice." In a bid to boost the soldiers' morale, he led the group as they picked their way to the opening of the nest. He snuck a careful look inside. The first intersection between tunnels was visible, but no Grosswings yet. Forcing himself not to hold his breath, he slid his body inside. The mud from the tunnel was cool and bore the stench of rot. The height of the tunnels made it impossible to stand. Instead, he crouched into an army crawl as he pressed forward. Ahead were more branching intersections at random intervals. Some formed shallow alcoves filled with decaying animal carcasses or shiny objects. A few of the narrower tunnels appeared to stretch into the darkness forever. His breathing hitched at the sound of something moving up ahead. As he pressed his body against the ground, his eyes could barely make out a dark gray shape passing through one of the intersections a short distance ahead of him. Fortunately, the star oil lantern was far enough back that the light was barely visible. The Grosswing continued on to rummage around in one of the side chambers. Cold sweat beaded on Thorne's brow as he heard the Grosswing slowly retrace its steps. His fingers instinctively tightened on his rifle as he strained his ears. He could lash out with his bayonet if he had to, but could he move fast enough to silence the beast before it could sound the alarm? The creature's shuffling footsteps continued to echo back as it entered another side tunnel up ahead. Its quiet scrabbling slowly faded away until nothing more could be made out. Thorn let out a long breath and waited several more moments before venturing forward. As he reached the side chamber the Grosswing had just exited, he ventured to poke his head in for a look. Inside was a veritable treasury of junk. There were heaps of smooth rocks, piles of cleaning rags, evidently stolen from the colony, and even an old boot. Far from the brightest of monsters, Grosswings were known to snatch anything that smelled right. Just as he was turning to leave, Thorn did a double take upon noticing light glimmering from a shiny object in the corner. After glancing back down the tunnel to ensure it was safe, he crawled the rest of the way into the chamber. The source of the light was a magical device that emitted a reddish glow. The center contained a grapefruit-sized sphere that crackled with tiny bolts of energy. The sphere was encased in metal slats and supported by a pedestal, a dispersion device. His jaw stiffened. When activated near a low-powered monster defense field, like a star oil lamp, this device would allow monsters to penetrate the field. It was sometimes used in guerrilla warfare in the outer colonies to make an enemy vulnerable to monster attacks. In their attraction to all things shiny, the Grosswings had unwittingly hauled away a valuable piece of evidence. Before, the destruction of the shield generator could have easily been taken for an accident. This device was the first solid evidence the colony was facing intentional sabotage. It also helped explain the concurrent attacks on the border of the colony, while the Grosswings were dive-bombing the interior. Thorn grimly stowed the device in his bag, before continuing deeper into the nest. He had hardly gone 3 yards when suddenly the top half of his body was dangling in open air. The tunnel ended abruptly in a large open pit that stretched out ahead of him. Bingo! He held his rifle in one hand as he unhooked the glowing red dispersion device with his other. His nose recognized what was in front of him before his eyes. The tunnel dead-ended in a large pit 20 feet deep and equally as wide. The floor of the pit was covered in bones and animal scat. Grosswings like to stow living food in steep pits like this where it couldn't escape. Thorn lay perfectly still as his eyes searched below for any sign of movement. Nothing. His face tightened in a grimace as he stared down at the empty pit. The reek of decay choked his lungs and made his head fuzzy, but there was no sign of anything alive. Either the villagers had already been eaten, or they were never here in the first place. Judging by the state of the decaying bodies below him, he concluded it was likely the latter. Taping his boot to signal the soldier behind him, he began to back away from the pit. They were still no closer to recovering the captives, and they were running out of time.
Laura. Laura had been grounded again for what felt like the last hour and was pacing back and forth in the clearing. Being left behind like this only made the embarrassment from her floating episode even worse. If only she had something to do, it would keep her mind off how pathetic she felt. The soldier who had been left to guard her straightened as Captain Thorn emerged from the edge of the clearing. He wore a serious expression as he waved the two of them to follow. "Get that tracking device started back up again. We will have to take a chance with the noise." His jaw visibly tensed as he continued. "We found an old nest, but there was no sign of the villagers." Just the look on his face made Laura's chest tighten. The more time passed, the less their chances of finding the villagers alive. Her fingers felt clammy as she brought the device to life, waving it in sweeping motions until the beeping evened out. She looked up to meet Thorn's eyes and nodded. She could feel each beep hammering into her spine as they continued forward into the woods. The closer they got to their target, the more the beeps intensified into something like the squawks of a dying animal. It seemed like the intensity would make it tear itself apart at any moment, or worse, attract the attention of some unspeakable predator. Captain Thorn stopped so suddenly that she almost walked into him. He stood motionless as he stared up at something ahead of them. A million horrific images flashed through her mind in an instant as he whirled around and waved his arms frantically for her to turn off the device. She switched it off and followed Thorn's gaze. It took several moments for what she was seeing to register. The words, "The Bountiful Gilligan," filled her view. They were written on the side of a medium-sized airship that appeared to be jammed into the ground near the edge of the Terra. The sandy dirt all around the crumpled airship was littered with bones and covered with clawed footprints. A pair of small Grosswings skittered into a hatch on the side of the ship. She gawked. How are we going to save the villagers from a Grosswing nest like that? Thorn was silent for a long moment as his eyes bore into the crashed airship. He pointed to a long crack along the spine of the ship that ran into the ground. I see heavy damage above the area where that crack meets the sand. We might be able to make an entry for ourselves through the area that has already been weakened. He wrinkled his brow in concentration. It looks like the few Grosswings that are awake are concentrated around the one open hatch closest to the woods. If we use the airship as cover, we can slip around the other side. Thank gods it is still daylight and most of the devils are still asleep. The group followed Thorn through the woods, keeping as much distance between themselves and the open hatch as possible. A crow soared overhead, but other than that, the area around the airship was still. There were also notably fewer footprints the farther they went along the side of the broken ship. The soldiers began to gently pick and pull at the planks surrounding the crack in search of a way in. Above them, Laura could hear the soft clicking and creaking of the ship's boards settling in the heat. Her stomach tightened. Was that a scream? She shook off the creeping feeling under her skin and continued helping the soldiers poke and prod at the wooden panels. Over here, Braylon whispered, waving them over to where he had pried up a loose plank. The crash had done a huge amount of damage to this part of the ship. Working together, the group was able to clear a hole just large enough for one person to squeeze through at a time. Sergeant Braylon entered first, then signaled for the others to follow. Laura took one last look into the sky, her stomach one big knot of apprehension, before steeling herself and following the soldiers into the dark wreckage. The inside of the ship was cold and damp. It was also almost totally dark, with only a small glimmer of light from the hole they had crawled in through. One of the soldiers relit their star oil lamp, and the light blue illumination danced across the boards of the airship. Splintered panels covered the floor, and portions of metal ribbing poked up from beneath the planks. The group came to a hatch within the passageway. Two of the soldiers slowly eased it open, checking for signs of danger on the other side. As they moved farther into the ship, the noises overhead grew louder. Laura could hear one of the Grosswings scuffling above them like a giant rat in an attic. The group went through another hatch that led farther into the belly of the ship. As they rounded a corner, they were surrounded by animal cages on either side. It seemed that the ship had been transporting livestock. Most of the cages were empty, but the Grosswings had refilled a few of them with a variety of unfortunate local creatures of various sizes, all still alive. It was a veritable menagerie of native animal species. Some of the empty cages had signs of being recently inhabited. However, none of the people from the colony were anywhere to be found. The air inside this part of the ship was rank. Laura covered her mouth and nose to try to lessen the smell of feces and rotting flesh. It was dizzying. She couldn't imagine how anything could live in these conditions. Ahead of her, one of the soldiers poked his head into a partially open hatch. The man let out a strangled gasp and flinched backward. Thorn joined the soldier and pushed the door open grimly. Laura covered her mouth to stifle a yelp as the half-eaten body of one of the airship's sailors fell through the doorway.
Thank you for listening to A Taymore Deception. Tune in every Wednesday for new chapters.